It's the 3rd of April, 2003, and I'm Negley Harte, and I'm in my flat in London talking to Professor Deirdre McClosky, who has flown in yesterday from Chicago and is en route to the Economic History Conference in Durham, where she's going to give the Tawney Memorial Lecture. Behind the camera I have, as usual, Giorgio Riello, and we also have with us on this occasion Pat Hudson, the President of the Economic History Society, whose voice may conceivably be heard later.
I should hope so.
We're old friends, so we're talking as old friends. You have the unusual distinction of being, I believe, the only person who has served on the council of the British Economic History Society and the American Economic History Association, of which, of course, you have been president and editor of the Journal of Economic History. But this is an extraordinary Anglo-American distinction.
Well, thank you. I served briefly on it. I found that I couldn't attend as many of the meetings as I hoped. So in the end, we decided to stop this. Yeah. But it's always fun to be immersed in inner Britain of academic life, to see how they do this thing. I've always been most amused by that.
Well, you're a frequent visitor here, and we always welcome you. But I think, I'm trying to remember when we first met. I think it was in 1967.
Yes, it was.
Because I believe that you came to spend the year 67, 68
I did.
To be a graduate student at LSE, where you found I was a homegrown graduate student. And that was the year when we met.
Absolutely. I was not in reality a graduate student at the LSE. I was on a Knox Fellowship from Harvard.
Right.
And so I was just kind of hanging out at the LSE. I remember I had a letter of introduction from Alex Gerschenkron to Jack Fisher, and I'm not sure what was in the letter, but it did not make Jack any sweeter. He was still pretty tough. So I was in Arthur John's seminar along with you, I believe.
Yes, indeed.
And a whole bunch of other people, Steve Jones, for instance.
Yep.
SRH Jones, and there were two other Americans. Nick Harley.
Nick Harley was around.
Who was also at Harvard, was also a student of Alex Gerschenkron's.
Right.
And Michael Edelstein.
Yes.
Who was a student at Penn.
Right.
And so we were the ferocious, smart aleck Americans.
Yes, I remember it well. Now, I wanted to ask you about Gerschenkron, and I want to ask you about Fisher.
Yes.
But I want to take a step back, because I take it we have to begin in Harvard a year or two before that.
Yes, indeed.
Because you read economics. You took your first degree in economics.
I certainly
now,
did.
In that period, did you become an economic historian?
Oh no, I was, as an undergraduate, I was just an economist, a Keynesian, a socialist, and I thought I wanted to be a transport economist, and so my undergraduate dissertation was called Road and Rail in India, an input-output study, and from that I learned how not to do economic research.
Did you do the social savings of railways in India?
No, it was
and did you produce a map of railways that were not built?
It was nothing so interesting as that. It was an input-output study of the demand for iron, and it was just terrible. It was an awful piece of work. And in my first year as a graduate research student, also at Harvard, one had to take a full year of economic history, as you no longer have to do. But I understand was an economist, and although I'd started at Harvard as a historian, I found you had to learn a lot. You had to read a lot of long books. You had to actually know things. And I found that offensive, so I changed to economics. But as a first-year student, you took Alex Gerschenkron's full-year course. Well, he started the course, and a week into it, he had a heart attack and couldn't go on. And so they had to find substitutes. And in the first term, the substitute was Barry Supple, who was visiting at the business school. And in the second term, it was Albert Imlaw, who taught at Tufts, which is close by. So those were my first two
Did
first
you
teachers.
already know Gerschenkron?
No, although my father was on the faculty at Harvard and was a friend, at least in the sense that men of that generation could have friends. They would exchange stories about the Boston Red Sox and arcane details of European history with each other.
So it can't be said that you were attracted to economic history because of Gerschenkron.
No, I found that one could do real applied economics that had something to do with the world, although a long dead world. I'd always been attracted by the glorious dead. I'm very uninterested in current economic policy. I can't get excited about the budget, but I can get excited about Gladstone's budgets. So through this course, I discovered that. I discovered that my interest in the past was what I should be. That's the kind of economics I should be doing.
So it was this course that Gerschenkron didn't give
Exactly.
that was the turning point. And
Well,
the turning point came therefore with Supple and with Imlaw. What did you make when you first came across him of Barry Supple?
well, he was charming as he still is. He's a working class boy, and that always comes through in him. He's very straightforward and democratic, small d. And the main thing that remains of this course, and I'm afraid this is our fate as lecturers, that the most bizarre details are all that survive in our students' memory. But I remember him explaining the flying shuttle, and he's a very athletic man. He was a cricket player, and he showed that.
Tennis was the
No, but he was a cricket player, a very good cricketer. And he would show that if you had a very broad piece of cloth, you would have to be an ape. And he stood before the class as an ape with very long arms to throw the shuttle. So you needed some mechanical assistance.
And then you had Imlaw. Now I didn't know Imlaw at all. I know he was the author of Economic Elements in the Pax Britannica.
Well,
but I don't know anything about him. Tell me about him.
Well, he was not as lively as Barry was, but I assume I learned what I learned from him is to respect, or at least read, an earlier generation of economic historians who weren't economists, who were not primarily theoretical or quantitative in their orientation. And my whole career has been like that, to learn successively that it's unwise to sneer at people. I started out at 19 thinking that economists knew everything, and I've only gradually come to discover that they don't know very much.
Right, so this first year as a graduate student, you were becoming an economic historian.
Yes.
On various levels and in various senses. And then by your second year, would Gerschenkron have recovered?
Yes.
And he now becomes an important influence on you there.
You know, an important influence in a way. It was I was in his seminar with a raft of very good students, Stefano Fenotea for a while, and although he was thrown out of the seminar because he quarreled with Gerschenkron, and Richard Such came down from MIT to attend the seminar, and Dick Sella, and Nick Harley, and Barbara Solo were all in this seminar, but Gerschenkron didn't ever say anything. He would just assemble these wild creatures, and like the games of ancient Rome, he would just watch them tear each other apart. And then at the end, he would offer a comment. He would tamp down his pipe, you know. And there was one particularly awful seminar by someone who wrote on the, I think it was the cotton industry in England. And it was a particularly stupid paper. I can't remember who the author was. And we just tore it to pieces. We showed that the numbers were wrong and the theory was stupid. And we just... And at the end, he tamped down his pipe, you know, because he had stopped smoking cigarettes for his heart. He tamped down his pipe and said, "Well," in this very thick Russian accent, "Well, we know a lot more about the cotton industry than we knew when we started." And that was it. The poor man wept, I'm sure.
But it was Gerschenkron who sent you to LSE.
Absolutely.
This letter of introduction to Jack Fisher.
He was very on these matters. He was our great leader, our king. Without a lot of interference, I had no conversations about my dissertation with Alexander Gerschenkron, although I wrote the dissertation with the man. We talked about the Boston Celtics basketball team and the defenestration of Prague, which was one of his interests, but we wouldn't talk about my dissertation. I didn't particularly care. That was fine with me, that I just did the dissertation. Harley had a hard experience on that count. He came back with his dissertation, and Gerschenkron said, "Well, you know, it hasn't got a point." And Nick had to admit that, well, it didn't have a point. So he went back for another year and gave it a point, an argument. But, so he wasn't a close supervisor, and I've adopted that style. I think to over-supervise is a mistake, because this is your first chance for independent scholarly work, and you should
Yes.
get on with it.
What was the now? Gerschenkron obviously thought very highly of Jack Fisher. I
Yes,
knew Jack
he did.
Fisher very well, as you know. Jack later told me that Gerschenkron had spent a lot of time trying to tempt Jack to come to Harvard
Yes.
to replace him for a year on, I think, 2 separate occasions. Jack, of course, had a young family quite late, and
Yes.
perhaps had good reasons for not going, was never attracted by America and never went.
Yes.
But there was a sort of, he must have just admired Jack's brilliance, I suppose. And Jack had the same sort of comparative.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps in Jack's day it was called colonial history.
Yes.
It later came to be called comparative economic development.
Yes.
But Jack had that sort of Gerschencronian comparative dimension.
Yes. Yes, I think Gerschenkron came to this, and this is a point that Bill Parker made once. From his experience, that is Gerschenkron's experience as a double refugee from the Russian Revolution. He grew up in Odessa, and then from the Anschluss, he came to Berkeley, and then finally to the Federal Reserve Board in Boston, and then in Washington, and then finally to Harvard. So he was, that is, Gerschenkron was extremely interested in points of view. His early work on index numbers is about points of view, and his more general work on industrialization, after all, is about points of view. Is it proper to view German industrialization from the point of view of the British? Or do you fail? Is there an index number problem in seeing the world from the British model, as he would argue? So that generation of emigres had a lot to teach us, especially in the United States.
No.
But yes, I came and studied with Jack, I suppose, although again, since I was not a formal degree student at either the at the LSE, it was the same relationship I had with Gerschenkron. I saw these men as models, as extremely smart men. I think that's why they admired each other, because they were both very intelligent, and they both played their cards very close to their chest, and were very interested in interpersonal power and influence, if you see what I mean. The influence of one clever person over others.
Yes, Jack was of course very clever, very quick-minded, but he was also very knowledgeable, and of course extremely witty,
all that,
and with an irreverent quality.
All that except for the irreverence applies to Gerschenkron, although he was not by any means a somber person. No. He had a great line of joking where he would claim to be acquainted with a great baseball player for the Boston Red Sox named Williams, and he would say that, you know, this baseball player was not a highly educated man, but he read a lot, and he was particularly interested in economic history. And people would say, "Oh yes, Alex, he is. How does he feel about Walt Rostow, for example?" And Gershentron would say, "Well, he says Walt Rostow hits a home run, hits it for 6 every time he steps up to the plate, but then he forgets to touch the bases as he runs around." And he had how does Ted Williams feel about Ken Galbraith? Oh, well, Ken Galbraith hits very high flies to very short left field. So this kind of wit charmed me as, I have to say, a young man. I don't think I would have been quite so enthralled as a young woman, because it was a very manly sort of wit. It was it was an oddly
competitive.
Yes, highly competitive, highly high table smart aleckness was at its premium
yes.
in such
yes,
company.
Surely. Well, of course, you were in your Donald phase at
Yes,
this
I was
time,
in my Donald
and
phase.
I can remember the first reference that I heard from you, because Jack Fisher met me, and he said, "Would I like to meet this American ghost that I would send over?" He said, "He's a stutter surrounded by a beard."
I had a beard at the time.
This was what Jack first thought. That was how you were described
that's
before I met you.
perfect.
And then when I met you, of course, it turned out to be true.
Of course, he was that way. He was very full of witty characterizations, like Gershengren.
He didn't then have a seminar. He'd allowed Tawny's seminar
That's
to
right.
lapse.
Yeah.
And Penny Caulfield and I began it again when we were sufficiently senior, I think in 74 or 75, to have a seminar that Jack then presided over for a few years. But the seminar that we all went to, you've already referred to, was the seminar run by Arthur John.
Yes, up at the
which
Institute.
Was at the Institute of Historical Research, in succession to the famous seminar that T.S. Ashton had held. So it focused on we said the long 18th century then, but it focused on the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
And we all went. What did you make of that seminar? Was it very different to the gladiators that you'd been thrown into in Harvard?
It was a complete contrast, and being outside British academic life, and in those days especially outside the British class system, we Americans were sort of like court fools, allowed to be outrageous, whereas the British students who had to make their livelihoods in this system were much more careful. So we would speak up and put our hands up and we had some terribly important point we needed to make and so forth. And I, of the three Americans there, was the worst offender, I think. But we would all go.
You were a lot of fun.
We all
and also rather clever as well.
Well, we were all clever then. I wasn't so clever then as I've ever been since. I was smartest when I was about 18, and I've been going downhill ever since.
What did you make of Arthur John?
Oh, he was a sweet man. He didn't seem to be very much of a scholar. I didn't think much of him. I didn't have personal contempt for him or anything, but I think he was in over his head, so to speak.
You were working on your thesis, which
Yes.
was on the British iron and steel industry
Yes, indeed,
in the late 19th century. Why did you work on that?
Well, because I was fascinated by big pieces of capital equipment, and the steel industry has big pieces of capital equipment. I had cousins who lived in Gary, Indiana, and had gone there and seen the steel mills from afar. In fact, we would, when I was very young, I remember a visit to Gary, where we would sit on Aunt Lo's front porch, and all my uncles and aunts drinking beer and watching waves of soot come across the street from the mills.
This was, and you talked about capital formation.
I thought about capital formation and coal usage. So it was, and then there was sort of a serious purpose. Although, of course, these are serious purposes. When I advise students on what they should do their research on, I say, is there something that just interests you, that just attracts you, because you played on the slag heaps as a child or something? Is there something that grabs you? Because you're going to be with this topic for a long time. Don't let me assign it to you. Think of something that you love. But the more academic explanation for the choice of subjects is that it had been claimed that the British iron and steel industry had failed entrepreneurially in the late 19th century. And it seemed smart to choose an industry that appeared to have failed to see if it had in fact succeeded. Because if you show that the bicycle industry or the shipbuilding industry succeeded in the late 19th century, you haven't shown much. You've only shown that something we already knew had done quite well. But I was in the grip in those days of a simple-minded positivism and a falsificationism, if you want to think in Popperian terms.
No.
And I was much under the influence of Bob Fogel's upper bound type of thinking. So it seemed to me that if I could prove that, honestly, trying to be fair, that the iron and steel industry hadn't succeeded, that would be a much more interesting thing to prove.
But why Britain?
Oh, that's an
as
important
opposed
point.
to America or, say, Germany?
That's an important point. Well, I didn't do Germany because I couldn't read German. I remember I went over to see, when I was still a graduate student at Harvard, I went over to see David Landis, who was an opponent of Alex Gerschenkron's in a famous debate in the pages of the Explorations in Entrepreneurial History in the early 1950s on the role of entrepreneurship in economic growth. David in favor of it, Alex against it. And I said, I'm going to do a dissertation on the British iron and steel industry, and he said, that's great. And I said, it's going to be comparative, which again is the Gerschenkron line coming through. And he said, oh, that's nice. And I said, I'm going to compare it with the American industry. He said, well, that's fine, but don't you think it would be more to the point to compare it to the German industry? And I said, yeah, that would be fine, except that I don't read German. And he said, what? You don't read German?
What?
No, he didn't say what. He was an American. He said, what? You don't read German? I said, no, I don't read any language. I read English. I'm not even very good at French. He said, what? You don't read French either? and he threw me out of his office and wouldn't talk to me anymore. He's quite surprised when I tell him this story. He says, "Oh no, I didn't do that." But he was very fierce in those days. So I chose England because I was an Anglophile. I had lived in England for 3/4 of a year when I was in my last year of secondary school in the United States. My father who was an academic, was on sabbatical, and we came over to England, and we lived in Camberley in Surrey for a while, and then out in a small agricultural village north of Salisbury. And I just spent the year hanging about. I didn't do any
And you
studies.
learned to like cricket?
No, not at that point. I didn't.
Oh.
I learned to like bitter beer. That's what I learned to like, mainly. And I had a lot of experience in that line. I was, and of course, my father was a big enthusiast for English literature, and had taught me English poetry. Thou still enravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme, etc. So it was very natural for a monolingual American to come to England.
Right. Now, you completed this work.
Yes.
And you completed a series of things that arose directly out of that.
Yes.
Did the Victorian economy fail?
Yes,
and
indeed.
various other things.
Mm-hmm.
But then your interest continued to widen.
Mm.
Within the context, we're now in the 70s.
Yes.
Within the context of what was called slightly aggressively the new economic history.
Yes.
And the term cliometrics was used, not in inverted commas.
Yes.
I think. Now you were very involved in all that.
Well,
enthusiastically involved in all that.
Yes. I viewed myself as as spreading the gospel, and I was I thought of myself as the apostle to the infidels, to the British economic historians who didn't quite appreciate that quantification and economic theory were the way to go. I remember the first term at the LSE, Christopher Hill came and gave a speech which I'm sure was much more sophisticated than I was able to grasp. But in the discussion session afterwards, this was very early in the year. This was in October or something.
It must have been a meeting of the Tory Society.
Absolutely. I hadn't begun to understand what this academic environment was like. He said at one point, "You know, these quantifiers, they're all illiterate." And so I, House of Commons style, jumped up. This is quite forbidden in British academic circles, and said yes, and or rather stuttered out yes, and the other historians are innumerate. So charged back.
Certainly true of Christopher Hill.
Well, it certainly was true of Christopher Hill. How much, how big, how representative, as J.H. Clapham famously expressed it, was something very far from Professor Hill's mind. So I viewed myself as bringing the new economic history to Britain. So that's what I tried to do.
And you continued to think that through the 70s?
Oh yes, I turned to agricultural history because I wanted to understand the industrial revolution, as we all do, as the most important historical event since the invention of language. And I wanted to, under the influence of the early law and economics thinking, which was very, very lively at the University of Chicago in those days, I wanted to study changes in property rights as a cause of industrialization. And I started out trying to inquire into the change in the law of contract. That didn't work out. There wasn't enough to do, and it was clear that I was not, and it occurred to me that enclosure would be a good instance of this, and so I started to work on enclosures, and from that it occurred to me that to understand enclosures, you needed to understand why property rights have been organized in the way that enclosure eliminated, and so I got into 13th and 14th century stuff. So
this is not rejecting quantification, but this is transcending.
Well, no, it wasn't. I wouldn't call it transcending. Unlike my work on iron and steel, my work on agricultural history was all entirely based on was all secondary. I didn't do any archival research on this, but I was trying to apply an economist's way of thinking to the question of why medieval open fields in England and lots of other places were organized as they were, in particular the matter of scattering, which scattering of plots. You hold a plot here and here and here and here. I interpreted as a matter of portfolio balance. I
spreading risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I thought of these medieval peasants as sort of stockbrokers in the city.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you went on to work on an even more diverse range of things.
Yes,
because you got interested in rhetoric.
Oh yes.
And you got interested in virtue.
I claim that it's all connected, and it will be revealed at the end what it all has to do with itself. But yes, I'm sort of an exploding star, maybe an exploding asteroid would be more appropriate. So I, as you say, I kept broadening my interests, trying to bring them back to, one always tries to make a coherence of one's life. And I think there's a coherence. I keep searching for it. It's just almost there. So I started very quantitative, and then observed that in actual academic and scholarly scientific practice, words mattered, as they did to people like Jack Fisher and Alex Gerschenkron. And I started to see that the way we argue, the way we use words, is weighty in science. And the claim that I had thought was obvious when I was young, which is that, oh, it's just a matter of quantification, and all we need to do is make this upper bound calculation, and that'll be it. I found this wasn't true. I found it was not true in a number of ways. It was not true that people would instantly agree with you. I found that even if this sounds very strange, but it's how I felt. I found that even if you're correct scientifically, simply stating the argument is not enough to persuade anyone. It just won't do. It's not. You can't. It's like in card playing. You can't just put down your hand and win. You need to argue it. So I got more and more interested in the words of science, so to speak.
Yes.
And from the words, I came after a long time to the conclusion that to a couple of conclusions. The first one is that so far as science is concerned, and I include chemistry and physics and mathematics, as well as the historical and economic sciences in this. So far as those are concerned, the only assurance that we have that science is being done properly is not a formula for science, a 3x5 card, a checklist of scientific methodology, as I had thought once. Mm-hmm. No, that's false. All we have, by way of assurance, is the morality of the scientist. In the end, our only assurance is that the other person is a ethically serious person who will be open-minded and will attend to the world and her fellow scientists in a serious way. So I came to the conclusion that science is ethical, and I came to the conclusion, on the other hand, that the economy itself is rhetorical. That words are not just important in the science of the economy, the historical science of the economy that is economic history, but that words, that I will walk with you, I will talk with you, what news on the Rialto, is how the business world, how the marketplace, how the household, how the factory actually operates.
Right.
And that is going to provide, I claim, the sort of the third act in my drama.
Let me ask you how gender fits into this. You've made a couple of passing references to gender.
Yeah.
And I know that you are keen to be a woman economist.
Yes.
Tell me, what is the difference between a woman economist and a male economist?
Well, I'm fond of saying that I become my own smarter sister. I think it's actually. I think it's profoundly true that to do science correctly, thoroughly, in this open-minded, ethical way, so that we really know what we're talking about. We must walk, as T.S. Ashton famously said, on both feet instead of hopping along on one foot or the other. Or to put it in gender terms, we need to use the characteristic the intellectual qualities of both genders. To put it in a more comprehensive way, we need to be good scholars. We need to be fully human. And I feel that this is changing gender is a somewhat radical way of becoming fully human. I assure you, it's not necessary. Nor, I'm afraid, is it sufficient. But I've found it, and I don't claim to be an expert at being a woman or a female scholar or anything like that, but I must say it's been surprisingly illuminating of the seriousness with which you need to take, for example, stories. Stories. As a man, just to give you some small insight into this, I was very uninterested in the personal stories of other people. I was not, if you told me about your cousin, I would, in the famous expression, would go in one ear and out the other. Now, quite spontaneously, I find myself understanding the role of story in people's lives and being much more interested in it. I think if I were to start all over again my career in economic history now, I would be a much better historian, because I would, so to speak, have more of the complete set of equipment that I think you need to be a good economic historian.
But besides this change in yourself, and change, I mean, in various different ways,
yes,
as your thought has matured, the
stumbled forward is the word, not matured.
The subject of economic history too has changed.
Yes.
And perhaps in some of the same ways that you've talked about has,
yes,
dare I say, matured again as a subject.
Oh, I
because
think so.
There isn't the narrow-minded quantification, and economic history, well, as you know, membership of the Economic History Society in this country has been declining, and all those separate departments of it that were set up in the expansion of the 50s and 60s,
yes,
many of them have closed down.
Yes.
I take it you think that's no bad thing, because it's part of the broadening of economic history and its integration with social and cultural history.
Yeah.
Do you feel happy about the state of economic history in Britain?
I was, for a long while, I thought that it was very odd to have a separate department of economic history. And of course, on my jihad of urging economic historians to be quantitative, I thought it would be just swell if it was merged with, if all of them were merged with economics departments. But the problem is that economics departments have their own problems, which I've thought about and written about quite a lot. I have a new little pamphlet called "The Two Secret Sins of Economics." The two secret sins, I think, vitiate most of what appears in economics journals, and therefore vitiates a good deal of what economic historians under the influence of economists do. So in that direction, it's not been so happy. And the problem is that if you merge with a history department, the temptation is to become a cultural historian of some sort, and the specifically economic aspect is often slighted. So so now, I mean, I've changed my mind on everything in my life. I was once a a lone socialist. I'm not a socialist now, I can assure you. I was once a man, I'm not a man now, etc., etc., etc. And I've changed my opinion about this institutional development too. I now think it's a shame there aren't separate departments of economic history.
Really?
Because for one thing, I think it's an excellent thing for an undergraduate to study in a thorough way. I think it prepares one for careers in the world a lot if it has enough economics and enough quantification sort of added into it. I should think it would be a superb preparation for the business world.
Right. But of course, in your lifetime, surely economics as a discipline has narrowed its vision increasingly.
Yes, it has.
Whereas history, on the other hand, has widened its vision.
It has indeed.
And has incorporated many of course, most of these things. You're interested in the cultural history, the social history,
yes.
the economic history, with no antagonism between these things.
It's true.
And no antagonism between quantification and literary approaches, I wouldn't say, within history.
Certainly not anywhere near as much as there was when Christopher Hill said that all quantitative historians were illiterate. No. So that Methodenstreit, if I may exhibit my German, has cooled.
Yes.
Although, I still believe that a great many important historical questions are quantitative.
Yes.
The way that I've changed is that I've stopped thinking that they all can be laid down on that Procrustean bed. That's the change. I think it's still a shameful mistake to go on talking about Victorian Britain failing when there's no quantitative evidence that it failed. It's still a very foolish thing to go on talking about how important enclosures were to 18th century economic growth, when in fact enclosures were small potatoes. The small potatoes problem is something that you don't appreciate if you're not, in the Clapham way, quantitative.
Yeah, because how can you tell how small the potatoes are?
Exactly. In the great and intelligent analysis that Clapham makes, I believe, in the second volume of his 3-volume Economic History of Modern Britain, of the extent to which industrialization had affected industrial processes in the middle of the 19th century, pointing out that there were vast areas that hadn't been changed. The British economy in 1850 was not one large dark satanic mill, nothing like it. There was still to be had in the second half of the 19th century an increase in steam power of a factor of 10. That kind of quantitative thinking, I think, is still insufficiently appreciated by most of our colleagues in history departments. They don't quite understand it because their only quantification is their page numbers.
Henry VIII had 6 wives.
He had 6 wives, yes, that's right.
But no Methodenstreit.
No, that's not.
And quantify where appropriate. Was that Marshall? So. Quantify where appropriate. It's the question of the appropriateness of... so we could agree about that.
Echt waar, as we say in Dutch.
I'm going to ask Giorgio and Pat if they want to ask anything, and then I'm going to ask you if you want me to ask you something, to talk about something that I haven't asked you about.
Yes.
Shall I turn first to Pat? Do you want to ask anything, Pat?
Well, I suppose the only thing we haven't asked about is the work you've been doing most recently on bourgeois virtue.
Bourgeois virtue.
And how that relates to your earlier remark about your shifting political perspectives and your basic ideology politically.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to write a book called Bourgeois Virtue, and it's an attempt to bring ethics back into the discussion of capitalism and modern economic growth in a serious way, as I said as I'm saying these days, it's to make, to take from the left the ethical high ground.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I view myself as speaking to the left. An awful lot of my friends are further to the left than I am.
Mm-hmm.
After all, if I didn't have such friends, I wouldn't have any, because I'm very far to the right on some things. And I feel that the way we've been speaking about capitalism since 1848 among artists and intellectuals has been scornful and sneering, and above all in my intellectual life, although I've committed it a lot myself, I'm against sneering. I'm against saying, oh, you can't say that, without inquiring into whether or not you actually can say that. So I claim, for instance, that participation in a market economy is not the soul-destroying experience that is often claimed. That's been claimed since Marx and Durkheim and Weber. I don't think it is soul-destroying. In fact, on the contrary, I think it's soul-enhancing. I don't think it always is, but I think it is more than has been allowed. And that the astonishing enrichment, the increase in British national income per capita since 1700, conservatively calculated of a factor of 13, has had a substantial spiritual effect. And it hasn't always emptied people. On the contrary, it's allowed them to have full lives. Everyone here has ancestors. I don't suppose there are any descendants of the crowned heads of Europe here. All of us have ancestors, as we as economic historians know much, much better than most other scholars, had lives not of quiet desperation, but just plain desperation. So there's a spiritual change that's possible from this material change, and surprisingly, that's the subject this fierce quantifier ends with.
Thank you.
that's of course a wonderful note on which to fade out. But Giorgio, I'm sure you want to
Well,
ask a question.
if there is time, yes. We are historians and we talked about the past. But, I would like to know your opinion. Where is economic history going in the future?
Well, I think I know where I would like it to go. I would like economic history to be as it has been, without quite understanding it itself, a field where economics and history are completed, so to speak. Go back to T.S. Ashton, where an economist walks on both feet, where an economist is not just a mindless quantifier, but understands context and culture and story and morality and faith and so forth. And on the other hand, where history itself is completed by being more than one damn thing after another, having some argumentative bite. Let me be controversial, as of course I don't ever wish to be, and say that a historian like the great Fernand Braudel is not my ideal. That he, for all his virtues, you arrive at the end of a Braudel book with the same feeling that Alex Gerschenkron pointed out in the first draft of Nick Arley's dissertation, that it doesn't seem to have a point. So making history pointed and making economics humane, these are tough but very important scholarly purposes.
Well, that's another nice note on which to end.